America's first serial killer, living in what would come to be known as the Murder Castle. An elegant and futuristic white city, temporarily constructed on top of the ashes of a devastating fire. The first Ferris wheel ever created, standing at 264 feet tall and able to hold thousands, more than any current standing Ferris wheel today. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair was nuts. It was the most grand and extravagant demonstration put on by a nation ever at its time. It set the stage for American exceptionalism and influence at the turn of the 20th century, and it introduced cultural mainstays in food, art, and entertainment. So let's talk about it. World's fairs used to be a big deal. Before the internet and globalization, it was a great way to show off your progress as a nation to the world. The Eiffel Tower was introduced at the 1889 Paris World's Fair, for example. Touchscreens, the telephone, color TV, the first video chat machines, ice cream cones, and x-rays all debuted at World's Fairs for the first time. That's right, people were on FaceTime in the 1960s thanks to World's Fairs. My personal favorite is the robot whose sole purpose was to smoke cigarettes.
Oh, yes, Electro, you do need a light too, don't you? All right, here you are. And folks, he's only 2 years old too. Just learning.
And in case you were wondering, he did have a little robot dog named Sparko. That was a great question, thanks for asking. America was a young nation at the time, and it wanted to highlight its inventors, artists, and scientists. It wanted to be taken seriously at the big boy table with Uncle United Kingdom, Cousin France, Mother Russia, and Germany, who doesn't get a cute name because he's gearing up to be a bit naughty in the coming decades. The theme of the fair was to be the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World in 1492, which led to its second name, the World's Columbian Exposition. This was back when Columbus was a cool dude that everyone seemed to like.
I never liked Columbus.
Hey, one.
Chicago was chosen as the host city after a voting process which also included cities like New York City, Washington, D.C., and St. Louis. Now, Chicago was probably picked for a few reasons. More space and undeveloped land than the established cities, chance to prove a young city and a young country had what it took to be an international cultural leader, and to show the resilience of the city, and by proxy America, after the Great Chicago fires of the late 1800s that had left the city devastated. The 1893 World's Fair was designed by Daniel Burnham and a team including Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect GOAT, whose first project in his illustrious career was a little green space in New York City called Central Park, if that rings a bell. The team selected Jackson Park, another Olmsted project, to be the area for most of the fair, a city park in South Chicago by the water. The buildings were designed using principles of neoclassical architecture, such as balance, symmetry, and spectacle. The centerpiece was a large water pool in the middle of the park representing Columbus's journey and the ocean that he crossed. Canals were constructed into the land connecting the fairgrounds via both land and water. There were boats lining the riverways that were used to move visitors around the city. This included classical Venetian boats and even a few fully electric boats. The exposition ran for 6 months and more than 27 million people attended, which was about a third of the US population at the time. A ticket cost 50 cents or about $12 in modern value. The main area of the fair holding a majority of the buildings was called the White City. Most buildings were made with a mix of plaster and cement and painted white as they were meant to be temporary. Of the 200 buildings erected for the fair, only 2 still stand in place today, including the Palace of Fine Arts, which was constructed using brick and steel because many nations wouldn't allow their precious art to be displayed in a non-fireproof building. The palace is now the Griffin Museum of Science and Industry. The second was the World's Congress Auxiliary Building, which is one of the few buildings located outside of Jackson Park. It is now the Art Institute of Chicago. The White City is widely recognized for initiating the City Beautiful movement and laying the groundwork for contemporary urban planning. Its cohesive design of landscapes, promenades, and buildings showcased the potential of a unified approach where planners, as well as both landscape and building architects, could collaborate on an integrated design. The White City inspired cities to focus on the beautification of the components of the city in which the government can control: streets, art, public buildings, and public spaces. So if you like nice parks, cool public displays, and clean streets, you have the White City to thank. The White City was so cool that it inspired the famous Emerald City from The Wizard of Oz. The author, L. Frank Baum, was obsessed with the World's Fair, moving to Chicago specifically for it and frequently visiting. Alright, now let's talk about the fun stuff, the attractions. The World's Columbian Exposition was the first World's Fair to have an area exclusively for amusements. This included a few carnival rides. Side note here, George Tilliou credited the amusement area at the fair as inspiration for his creation of America's first major amusement park in Coney Island. Most notable of the carnival rides was this big old wheel made by some Ferris guy. Ferris created this wheel just for the fair. The huge structure was 264 feet high with 36 cars that could hold up to 60 people each, giving a total capacity of 2,160 people. The world's first moving walkway was introduced with two options: a seated division and a standing or walking division. It ran on a loop down the length of the pier. Fare was 5 cents. It could seat 40,000 people and had multiple tracks with different speeds. The US collaborated with Spain to construct life-size reproduction of Christopher Columbus's 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They sailed from Spain to America for the exposition and were a popular exhibit. Eadweard Muybridge, whose naming suggests pronunciation as Edward, but I refuse to, showed off his Zoo Praxiscope, an early device for displaying moving images and an important predecessor to the movie projector. He was able to convince paying customers to watch his moving pictures, effectively becoming the world's first commercial movie theater. On top of the moving walkway and the Ferris wheel, on exhibit was the first fully electric kitchen, including burglary detection system, automatic dishwasher, and a glass door oven, a prototype for pressurized aerosol spray. Side note too here, this was created by a guy named Francis Davis Millay, decorations director for the expo, who used it to spray paint the White City buildings, well, white. Mark Twain was his bestie and the best man at his wedding. You can see a fountain dedicated to Millay and his possibly secret gay lover right by the White House in DC. Both died in the sinking of the Titanic. Back to inventions here. We had the first practical electric automobile, which is impressive considering practicality still seems to be an issue to this day with electric vehicles. And the White City also held a very complex early version of a modern plumbing system to support the huge population of people visiting every day using the 3,100 toilets. A bunch of popular food was also created for the fair, so let's do a quick lightning round. Go! The brownie was invented for the fair. Juicy fruit gum was too, and Cracker Jacks. And peanut butter also gained notoriety and exposure, soon becoming a household name. You also had
Pabst Blue Ribbon,
which got its iconic blue ribbon from reportedly winning an award at the fair for best beer. Many famous American and international painters and sculptors submitted their works to be displayed throughout the fair, including more than 1,200 paintings and 800 sculptures. Of the sculptures, most notable was the Statue of the Republic. The statue was a 65-foot-tall gold-plated statue of a woman, deconstructed a few years later. Fret not though, you can still see a mini version, as a 24-foot replica was set up in honor of the original. Famous musical artists performed as well, including composer and conductor John Philip Sousa, widely known for American military marches such as the National March of the United States and the official March of the United States Marine Corps. Your grandpa would probably know him. There was Cissy Retta Jones, a world-renowned opera singer who sang for 4 consecutive US presidents and the British royal family. She was the highest paid black performer of her time. Joseph Douglas, violinist and grandson of abolitionist Frederick Douglass, played to packed crowds. After his performances, he became the first black violinist to make international tours. Side note 3 here, Frederick himself attended the fair in protest of how black Americans were being treated and exploited in the production of the exposition. He managed to eventually sit down and speak with many international leaders about the mistreatment and the racism. The king of ragtime, Scott Joplin, performed. His most popular piece, Maple Leaf Rag, was ragtime's first and most influential hit. It was to ragtime what Smells Like Teen Spirit was to grunge a century later. Joplin died in 1917 from neurosyphilis and spent his last years failing to find a producer for a ragtime opera he created titled Treemonisha, long after the success of his earlier recordings. His death marked the end of the ragtime era, sort of like how Kurt's death marked the end of grunge. However, Scott's music saw a resurgence in the early 1970s with the release of the Academy Award-winning film The Sting, which adapted many of his works. A re-recording of Joplin's piece The Entertainer reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. This resurgence in Joplin's popularity finally led to Joplin's dream to have one of his works fully orchestrated on stage, Treemonisha, 60 years after his death. The Expo became the battlegrounds for the War of the Currents, a growing competition and rivalry between early electricity schools of thought, Thomas Edison's direct current and Westinghouse's alternating current. Westinghouse severely underbid the contract, winning it, but had issues keeping up with the huge electrical demand of the city. Nikola Tesla, another AC proponent, showed up and demonstrated wireless electricity. Using a darkened room, he would light up gas discharge lamps using nearby Tesla coils and allow guests to hold them and walk around free of wires. Alright, fine, let's talk about the serial killer. So murderer, major scam artist, and all-around not-so-great guy H.H. Holmes used the Chicago World's Fair to his benefit to commit fraud and murder. He worked in Jackson Park where the World's Fair was set to be held and owned a large house which became known as the Murder Castle. I think naming a place like that is just asking for trouble. Holmes built a 3rd floor to the house and got investors on board by claiming that he would rent the floor out as a hotel during the exposition. Throughout the fair and after, he used the increased traffic and wealth pouring into the city for his financial benefit, killing to cover his tracks. In all, he confessed to 27 murders, but he also had a weird habit of confessing to some murders that he didn't do, so it's not certain what his KD was at the end. The media went crazy with this story, and it was actually an early example of exaggeration and sensationalism in journalism in order to sell more copies. Luckily that went away, right? These newspapers labeled his home as the Murder Castle, and claimed it contained secret torture chambers, trapdoors, gas chambers, a crematorium, maze-like hallways, and dead-end staircases. Although we call him a serial killer, he technically isn't, since he had clear motives for killing these people other than just, hey, that sounds like a good way to spend a Tuesday afternoon. He wasn't systematically committing similar crimes to fulfill a psychological urge. But on the other hand, he did literally dissect and kill small animals as a child, which is like the most serial killer thing I've ever heard. The end of the fair was a bit of a letdown. 2 days before the fair's closing, popular Chicago mayor Carter Harrison Sr. was assassinated. Closing ceremonies were canceled in favor of public memorial services held on the grounds. After closing, there were some plans to make the White City permanent, but damage from rioting, fires, and heavy snow ended any discussions. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair was nuts. I don't think we'll ever see something like it again, with its sense of scale, wonder, and progress relative to its time. This was at the cusp of the modern world we know today. Only an event set on the line between 2 distinct eras could truly embody the dreams and the passions of an entire species, as well as their shortcomings.